The fact that Macron finally did what like every French administration has been encouraged to do, it is interesting to me that that has completely broken French politics.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and our French expert is Robert Morris.
Well, thanks for that, Rory. I'm not entirely certain that's accurate. There have been periods when I have followed French politics closely, but what we're doing today is attempting to cover something we probably should have covered a number of weeks back, which is the French elections, which have now morphed into sort of a governing crisis in France. Both of us, doing our customary research, were a little bit daunted by the complexities of, let alone French politics, but French parliamentary procedure, or elections procedure. And I think I've kind of got it in my head at this point, but please do bear this episode with more of a grain of salt than normally. It's entirely possible that what I'm describing here in terms of the constitutional minutiae is entirely incorrect, but I think I got it. And there are some broader issues that we'll be talking about that I am more confident on.
And the other issue is this is still quite a fluid situation. The government may have collapsed by the time this episode goes out. Strange things happening after we record never happen, so maybe that should be okay.
Well, the crazy thing, the most recent news is I don't believe they have a government yet. We had to just the brief story here, and what made it so surprising and earth-shattering was A, the fact there was an election at all. B, the first round of elections on June 30th looked like something that has been threatened for my entire adult life going to happen, which was going to be the French far right, sort of under the Le Pen family. This has been threatened so long that the father Le Pen is out of the picture. Now it's Marine Le Pen. This was finally going to happen. And then actually quite impressively, and then also surprisingly, centrists and leftists in France that hate each other came together to defeat the right. However, this resulted in this interesting situation where the largest party, not large enough to have a majority, the best representative of the National Assembly is a fairly left, by the standards of the United States or the United Kingdom, insanely far left.
Yes.
But not so far left by French standards. But
I think the centrist party in France would be considered radically left by American standards.
Yes. The left party has the most seats, not enough to form any kind of government. Number two is actually the remnants of Macron's centrist coalition. And then number three is the right-wing folks. So everyone just sort of assumes that, well, okay, the centrists and the leftists are going to sort of agree on a government, and because together they absolutely vastly outnumber the right. However, now that the right has nominally been vanquished on July 7th, something of a humiliation for Le Pen and the rightists, we get back to the fact that the centrists and the leftists in France absolutely hate each other. They all kind of hate Macron,
yes,
which is something we'll get into. It's kind of a mess, and France does not, at this point, really have a government, because I think the old prime minister resigned, and Macron, one of the main, really, in some ways, one of the only strong delineated powers of the French president is the ability to name the prime minister. Of course, he has to name a prime minister that the newly elected parliament can accept. And I believe the most recent news, as of the time of this recording, is that Macron refuses to nominate any such, or choose, or whatever the appropriate terminology is, any such prime minister until after the Olympics, at some point in August. Amazingly, it seems like the centrists and the leftists, where enough of them were able to get together to prefer up a candidate, and he was kind of like, nah, we're going to wait. We're just going to let you stew. And that's kind of a dynamic that will emerge across this episode, which is kind of Macron as just a Titanic spoiler. He just seems to want to watch the world burn, I guess, is perhaps an overstatement, but does seem to be kind of a subtext of this story, or a text of this story rather than a subtext.
This all started when he called a very early election a snap election that was about 3 years early.
Yes.
And some people were thinking that he may call a snap election by the end of the year, but this was even earlier than the people that thought it would be early. So, but he's definitely done exactly what he wanted to do, which was to stop the fascists. Because these aren't like normal right-wingers when you say, oh, they're a bit right-wing, they like Tommy Robinson or whatever. Like, this is proper neo-Nazis. They thought the Nazis were great. Front National coming about. So it's good they can at least unite to defeat that, and then they can't agree on anything else.
Well, the thing is, I'm not entirely certain that that was what Macron's aim was. I think there's a lot of speculation. Getting into the French Constitution, which we are both very shaky on, French president is, in the European context, surprisingly powerful. Honestly, in the context of most parliamentary democracies. The United States, and I think to some extent following in the United States' footsteps, a lot of American, Central American, and South American countries use a presidential system, which emphasizes the president very heavily. But most of the rest of the world goes for a more parliamentary system where actually the president is kind of a head of state with only symbolic powers. Israel is an example. The prime minister is the guy who matters, the guy who goes on visits, and then the president. There's an Israeli president who will occasionally go do visits or what have you. Just not really that important.
I almost feel like just to give a sort of context, like the King of England would be like the president of most countries. Like theoretically, they have a lot of power, but in reality, they just go around the world shaking hands, meeting delegates, and advertising their country around the world. And the prime minister does the real work. They stay at home and, make sure things are ticking over, the bins are getting collected. But France is different.
I think that's a really good parallel. Like a lot of countries, the president is kind of a replacement monarch. It's, in the context of, say, before the World Wars, most of these systems had already moved to a point where the monarch wasn't that important and sort of was just doing ceremonial stuff. After the World Wars, it became less fashionable to have any kind of royalty. So the countries that don't have a constitutional monarchy will often have a president to go and do ceremonial stuff. Just briefly, Turkey, that used to be the way things were done in Turkey, though the president still had some minor powers. And then Erdogan, jammed through a constitutional change that made Turkey more presidential, coincidentally at the point where he had become term limited for being a prime minister and wanted to move into the presidency. But anyway, so France has all been weird. France has always been weird. France is in what is known as the Fifth Republic, which I think is the constitution as settled in 1958. However, there have been constitutional revisions since. I think the most recent was 2008. But it does seem, at least for my adulthood, that there has been a somewhat normal tempo to the elections. The president has many more powers, is more significant, is the person about, seen as making decisions. But the reason that's not necessarily constitutional power, the reason that they've had that power is because the parliamentary and the presidential elections are traditionally at about the same time. And traditionally, the guy who wins the presidency, I guess it's always been guys at this point. I miss Ségolène Royal. We all had hopes. But we don't have hopes for Marine Le Pen. But it does seem like the presidency is, and the parliament, almost, by design-ish, but more by luck, tend to be controlled by the same people for most of this time. So the president, despite lacking that many formal powers, more formal powers than most, as we just described, but, it's his party that's in control of the parliament, so he can sort of do things. That's traditionally the way that it's worked in France. It's not the way it's working now, but actually it hasn't been the way it's been working since 2022 when Macron secured re-election. That parliament was also incredibly frustrating to Macron and left him without much to do because it was not fully controlled by his party, which is kind of weird in modern French history. And it speaks to kind of why Macron is president, at least by 2022, is the dominating factor in French politics has been fear of these fascists, as you say, the currently known as the Rassemblement National, or the national movement or something. I don't know what the Rassemblement means.
National Rally.
National Rally, that's it. Rassemblement. No. It's interesting. Some of the North African electoral politics uses similar terms because it was all. I think there was a Rassemblement. I think Tunisian dictator Ben Ali had a Rassemblement party. I think,
and also France is still in a lot of North Africa.
Well, yes. Less so in the sort of the North. I'm thinking more Arab North Africa, which is, of course, they're still there in many, many ways, but not quite as directly as they are in the Sahel, or at least were until recently. But I think just before we get into this, before we get into the minutiae, perhaps because we're not so strong on the minutiae, I think it's worth talking about a little bit of the context here, which is it's a very. I was thinking about this. It's a very neoliberal frame where we're going to look at this through. That I want to look at this through. But I think it's a very important factor in the rises and falls of governments in contemporary Europe. That isn't really a factor in the United States quite yet, and that is basic fiscal stability, traditional ideas of maintaining a certain level of debt to GDP ratios, certain kind of fiscal control. As we've covered many times on this podcast, the United States doesn't really have to deal with that because of the way that the world's finances have evolved, the way the central nature of the United States Central Bank.
And also the Republicans will claim that they'll reduce spending and then spend loads.
Yes, well, that is certainly a dynamic. You have Obama and Clinton who actually tried to do some fiscal stability, and Biden's great innovation as a Democrat was that he started spending like a Republican. So really nobody in the United States is, and I am not someone, and I think probably under the Obama administration the government spent too little money, but I don't think anybody with any sense of proportion or sanity thinks that Trump and Biden should have been spending more money. But regardless, at least up to this point, we haven't had to deal with the consequences of those choices. The European politicians get a lot of guff for their obsession with austerity. I think that's a valid critique for Germany and the EU as a whole. But until the EU as a whole decides to actually unify its finances and start using its economic weight to, make the same sorts of selfish decisions of mass that the United States is capable of, the fiscal stability of individual governments really matters. We saw that with Liz Truss. Liz Truss was the UK Prime Minister for
a month.
What was it? Something like a month. What took her out wasn't her weirdness, her lack of good ideas to deal with things. What took her out was essentially bond vigilantes. Essentially folks who made British debt look unviable because of some policies she had proposed. And, oh, wow, okay, if the finance lords don't like her, she's out. And that's sort of, I think, a vital subtext to what we're talking about with the whole Macron presidency, which I don't think people are going to like much because I think a lot of people are like, Macron is just this out-of-control dictator, wannabe Jupiter. I think he actually might have described himself as Jupiterian at some point or something like that. So don't get me wrong. Like Macron is a no. I don't think people use the. I should be careful about throwing around dictator, because I don't think anybody's really calling France authoritarian or anything along those lines. But I think there's a broad sense that Macron is this sort of selfish, out of touch guy who's pushing things on France that France can't handle. The thing is that what Macron has pushed on France is kind of what finance overlords, neoliberals, the folks who decide whether or not France can continue to borrow money, just sort of international financial elites. Macron did many of the things that they had, that those elites, the folks who write or at least dictate what is written in The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, places like that. So Macron did what they had been saying France should do for decades. And Macron actually has done some of that.
it feels like he's touched something that's, stereotypically sacred to France, which is retirement age.
Absolutely.
That seems to be the big one that both National Rally and New Popular Front are both basically like, we want to change that. He wants to bring the retirement age up to 64.
Well, I think, he wants to take the retirement age from 62 to 65, was at least what I saw on a Bloomberg thing this morning.
So the National Rally want to keep it at where it is, and then the New Popular Front want to bring it down to 60. I remember seeing some documentation for myself, and it was basically assuming I'd be retiring at 70. So what's the average retirement age in America, Rob?
Well, we don't really do that so much anymore.
Oh, work to
death? Well, so technically, I think it's 65, 67, you're supposed to start taking. We have a national pension scheme. It, depending on where you live, though less and less with what's been happening to housing costs over the past 5 years, depending on where you live, Social Security can provide at least a chunk of a decent living as an old person. But more and more, it seems like you could probably live on Social Security as a 70-something if you wanted to move into a small condo on your way to, in a small apartment on the way to a retirement home or something along those lines. You probably can't afford an assisted living facility, though I guess Medicare comes in with that. But so I think what I'm trying to say is that it seems like more and more old people in the United States are working to supplement their Social Security, which is not one of my favorite things about my country, Rory.
Okay.
I haven't seen stats on that.
But France, I feel like, has a lot of the sort of stereotypical over-the-top help, or state help that's given to its populace that Americans love to shake their fist at and say, why don't they spend all their money on weapons and defend themselves?
Yes, exactly. That is absolutely and the long-standing dynamic. And it is that sort of Anglo-Saxon economic global hegemony has been wanting a French president to do the things that Macron has done forever. This has been like a real sort of demand. And it is kind of a broader question. It's sort of like, well, under that sort of dispensation of U.S. hegemony, this is something that kind of had to happen eventually, right? But I guess it is kind of a more open question. And I think that to some extent, but I think not really, both the NFP, the left coalition, and the RN, the Le Pen, the crazy right, group are talking about living in a world sort of like post American empire, post financial straitjackets of the. I mean, they're not, but like so. Basically, what I'm saying is that unfortunately, I think I might be a little more pro Macron than I would like to be.
Okay,
I've talked about this. I've talked about this before, whereas I have become wholly convinced that the United States and the United Kingdom have had too much of Anglo-Saxon economics, and in those contexts, I'm a New Deal Democrat. I don't know if I'm quite a Clement Attlee Labour Party guy, but I think both of those English-speaking countries need to move back towards social provision, higher taxes, and the other thing. But I'm not entirely convinced that the critique of France that I've been internalizing for 20 years, that it is too. I'm not saying that France needs to go to the United States where all the old people are working in Walmart, or the United Kingdom where like the cherished NHS is being butchered and seems to be on the brink of being privatized. I am saying that like moving the retirement age from 62 to 65, or liberating the labor market, which was something that I had French friends complaining about throughout my life. Of course, the French people that I've tended to intersect with are the French people who travel internationally and are likely to be more affluent. So perhaps that's a. But what I'm saying is like it doesn't. The fact that Macron finally did what like every French administration has been encouraged to do. It is interesting to me that has completely broken French politics. And it is, I think it is a vital subtext of this election conversation that we're not getting. And to be clear, like Macron is a symptom of French politics already being completely broken back in 2017. There was a more or less two-party system. I think it was the socialists and the Republicans. I could be entirely wrong with this. And of course, it was never a two-party system with the ossified nature of the United States or even Britain, really. It was always a little freer form than that. But for at least the elections in my adult life up until 2017, there was an established party system in France with a more center-right, a more center-left, and that they would compete. And in the 2017 elections, I think both presidential and legislative, because at that point, they were together. Both of those, imagine like the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, I guess you can imagine the conservatives getting entirely blown out of the water now. But the conservatives and Labor, or the Republicans and Democrats at the same time being completely blown out by a completely new party. And that is what Macron's party, En Marche, which I think has now since been renamed a couple times to now Renaissance.
Or Together?
That's Ensemble. That's the coalition, I think, for the legislative election. Whereas I think Renaissance is Macron's party. So in 2017, it already looked pretty revolutionary in France to just have this two-party system that had persisted to some extent for decades, or at least two major parties, just be utterly swept away. And Macron had commanding majority in the legislature, as well as being the president from 2017 until 2022. And it's interesting, I think the pension reform somehow through some coalition in the legislature at the time, he might have rammed through in 2023, just barely avoiding a vote of no confidence is my understanding. I assume that the vast majority of the reforms he was able to accomplish were accomplished in that period between 2017 and 2022 when his party also controlled the parliament. I think what's interesting is that the Wikipedia page hadn't quite been updated yet. And they described the results of the 2022 legislative elections in France as being unprecedentedly messed up and close to a hung parliament. And at no point since at no point in the Fifth Republic had things been there, or maybe it was back during Mitterrand at some point, had the president of the parliament been this split or whatever. And that was in 2022, Rory. So I kind of think like this choice that Macron made may not really have been about trying to defeat the right or something along those lines. I've read some convincing theories that his expectations actually with these snap elections was that the right would win.
Yes, that's a theory I've heard that would make them look so bad that they would then collapse and he could come back to power and save everything.
Because the president does have it's only custom, just the way things had been, that had the legislative election and the presidential election happening at the same time, largely, I believe, because I don't know this full history here, like most French presidents had simply not used that presidential power to dissolve the legislature and call a snap election. Macron did. And I think he kind of did so. So essentially he is in power until 2027, unless somehow, well, I don't think there's enough of a parliamentary majority to actually kick him out. Because I think the parliament has that power, perhaps with a vote of no confidence. Again, we're getting into the constitutional minutiae I do not have a full grasp of. But there's not a majority that could do that. He's there through 2027 regardless. I initially thought, well, he just wants chaos so he can ride in as a hero at the next presidential election, right? But it turns out he's actually term limited. So no, he can't do that. I don't know what Macron was thinking. I think that there was there's some indication that he wanted to be there as president to keep things from flying too far off the handle and also be able to make the right-wing folks in charge of parliament look stupid.
So his party did lose seats while the left gained the most and are the largest, and the right also gained but are still the third largest.
Yes, they're the third largest, so it's very interesting what happened in the election, and I think I've just still got it in my head, so we'll get there. But there's more in the run-up to this. So I think in 2022, and this is key, this was a key part of his victory in 2017, I think less so in 2017. I think this is his entire victory in 2022. In 2017, it was broad-based anger at the entire French political system, and why I think most people breathed a sigh of relief that Macron, this guy who had been, I think he was like an industries minister in the Socialist Party or something along those lines, that this guy was here. He was a socialist, but he was also a former banker, and he was young and sexy and new and talking about reforms and this, that, the other thing. And I think people were very relieved that he was there to sort of pick up this anti-establishment anger and sort of essentially take over France in an election in 2017. By 2022, people were already pretty damn angry at Macron. We had the Gilets jaunes riots. I mean, the French are always rioting, but it was an interesting detail in the United States where right-wing media were like, wait a second, some of these guys are rioting in a way that could be interpreted as kind of right-wing, which is, I think, generally wrong because at root, I think most of these folks were most angry about reforms that Macron had made that were anti the social welfare state.
One point on French protests is quite often unions use protests and strikes as the very last thing. But in France, it's right at the front. It's one of the first things you do. So that's why we see France protesting so much. But they do get a lot of rights for their workers.
Which is why it was so cursedly difficult for any French government to introduce any kind of the neoliberal reforms that the rest of the world wanted France to undertake. And Macron managed to sort of
get some through,
bring it through. Yeah. There's also just speaking of sort of English-speaking right-wing approach here is that France is super left, and actually Macron's not very left.
I say he would be definitely classically European or classically center for European.
Yeah, he's liberal or whatever. He is pro-business for sure, and also the French are angry about all the Muslims or whatever, and isn't that great that those? And it's actually Macron is. There's a lot of Macron treatment of Islamic citizens of France that's pretty gross.
Definitely
objectionable. Yeah, I mean, that's
something the left is talking about. Is definitely a lot more rights for immigrants coming in.
So yeah, I mean, Macron has been brutal to migrants. Macron
because he's trying to steal votes off the right.
yeah, and then he's also been pretty. It's important to remember that most of the Muslims in France have been there for generations because France invaded and attempted to control North Africa for a century.
But I think it's also harder quite often if you're, not white essentially. You're never quite considered fully French. When in places like Britain, you're generally just, you're British, and there's sort of not always no qualms, but significantly reduced. I think the French non-whites find it much harder.
I think famously, I don't know if this is still the case, the French refused to even do counts. I think the censuses we have, or rather in the French census, that you're just French. You're just French. So in the name of the state, in the eyes of the state, theoretically, and this is, France is actually, it has no interest in multiculturalism. There is no difference between French citizens. This can sound noble or elevated, but in practice, in the way that things actually work in France, it seems as though it is a much rougher place to try to make it work.
Definitely compared to somewhere like America.
Let alone as a refugee, but just as a Muslim citizen who's been there for a couple generations. Yeah, and that, we are absolutely the same, and nobody can. So because we're all absolutely the same, nobody can wear a hijab. It can get to that extreme as well. But I haven't prepared to get in the minutiae of that today. But anyway, so this is the situation with Macron in 2022. He ends up getting reelected as president almost entirely because everybody's scared of Le Pen, who I was shocked, actually. I didn't realize back in 2022, I somehow missed this, she got 40% of the vote to be president, which is honestly quite shocking. And I think an indicator of just how unpopular Macron was, and I think the fact that he is there for a second term is because he was the most credible, plausible force that could keep Le Pen out of power. And I think to some extent, his mandate at any point, his mandate for the reforms he's put through, has been kind of questionable because he's always been able to say, "Hey, I'm the alternative to this right-wing nightmare." And I think that's still the case. That's still the case today, and what we saw finally in 2024. So on June 9th, 2024, we had the European Parliament elections. And I don't have the results at my fingertips, but the success of Le Pen in that election was shocking and disturbing. The weird thing is, though, I mean, European Parliament, I think we've discussed this before, European Parliament elections are important. This is the parliament that governs the EU to some extent. But the extent to which countries have actually internalized that as important elections is I think, somewhat disputed or somewhat questioned.
Yes, you do tend to get a lot more fringe candidates or candidates that make the country themselves embarrassed because they're maybe less professional or, might spout conspiracy theories. So you can get a lot more of your crackpots sneak into the European elections.
Well, and because the European Parliament at this point doesn't have as much control over the daily lives of citizens of individual countries as the local legislatures, to say the least. And so the participation in these elections is typically lower, and it's generally seen as a protest vote.
Yeah.
So what I think Macron's reaction to this was like, okay, really, you're gonna vote all these right-wing folks in? Okay, how about we give you a real election that actually matters? And that's the fact that he called the surprise snap election starting on June 30th was a result of the success of the right wing on June 9th. But I think there's probably I think he was probably really frustrated at the lack of power he had in these legislative elections and was kind of like, I'm not going to get anything done anyway, so why don't we just go full clown show? And some people have said that he's been defeated in his aim, the right wing not winning, but I kind of think he just wanted a clown show that could allow him to focus on foreign policy and not really have any responsibility for not moving any further forward in reforms. And I think that's what he got. So I don't know necessarily that his gambit failed, as many people have said, even if that was his gambit, getting the right wing in to make fools of themselves. So yeah, he just was frustrated, and he called this election on June 30th, and that is when we got the results that everybody found so terrifying. As I think we've talked about earlier in this episode, the prospect of the crazy right-wing government of France has been terrifying since, I think, was it 2002? Does that sound right? I think was it all the way back in...
Well, yeah. Le Pen's been running since 2012 and has had that specter.
Well, but that's Marine Le Pen has been running since 2012. Her father, I think, had a surprisingly good result in the early 2000s. Of course, that surprisingly good result, I can't even recall which election it was in, was like 17% or something. So the fact that they'd even gotten over the barrier you needed to get over to have parliamentary representation was horrifying back then. And that's just sort of been this ongoing dynamic. And between June 30th and July 7th of this summer, the world kind of thought, oh, damn, like, we're going to get it. We're finally going to get France governed by Le Pen and her right-wing party. That is not what ended up happening. Okay, so here we get to the complexity that it was so cursed that I was having such trouble with this morning, but I think I've got it. Basically, the rules, the reason that there are two rounds. There's two rounds to a parliamentary election. It seems a little confusing because a lot of...
is it because it's first past the post, which makes it a bit more complicated, and a lot of the other parties are pitching for proportional representation. So it seems like you get a lot of the difficult issues of the UK Parliament, but it doesn't have the same two-round thing, but you don't also vote for a Prime Minister in it. But yes, this is, I guess, their general election.
Yeah, the first past the post thing is a weird issue. And I think in most contexts of a runoff election, we'll see a whole bunch of people run against each other, and then you have a runoff where the top two go up against each other. What makes this confusing and what made what happened between June 30th and June 7th possible is that it's the cutoff is actually not the top two. It's just anybody who gets over 12% of the vote. So on June 30th, there were a whole bunch of people running for each of these little seats. I don't know, maybe there are 5, 10, 12 people running for each individual little seat. And everybody who got under 12% of the vote is knocked out for the second round. So you have, even though it's the second round, you could, I think I looked at this, there are 577 seats in the National Assembly. This is not, there's apparently an upper house that is less important, the Senate, which has elections every 3 years, and we're not going to talk about it all. But the National Assembly, 577 seats, 311 of those seats had more than two folks running against each other in the runoff. So what that meant was, so what happened in the first one was that and this is crazy, in the first round, the right-wingers won 33% of the vote, compared to 28% for the left and 21% for Macron's coalition. So, and actually in the second round, the right-wingers won 37% of the vote. So they actually did significantly better. But what happened, which was, I agree, actually quite inspiring.
Oh, so yes, that's 37 of the popular votes. So just the raw votes totaled.
Exactly. But what was inspiring is that the Macron coalition and the left coalition agreed to work with each other. And this is only really possible in this first past the post system where each individual constituency. So essentially,
yes,
in a constituency where there were three, the Macron guy, the right guy, and the left guy were running against each other.
Uh-huh.
The Macron person and the
New Popular Front
got together and said, hey, it looks like you've got a better chance, so I'm going to drop out and endorse you. So they essentially, at least, exclusively probably, for the purposes of the election, became a sort of grand anti-right coalition, which is a great thing. It would be kind of nice if we could see a little bit more of that in the United States, with sort of like left and center getting together against the right. And it worked. So even though the right vote increased in this runoff election, the coalition together of centrists and leftists still had 50% of the vote. And by using that strategy, they actually created the situation that we finally got, which was the left winning 180 seats.
So you need 289 to have an outright majority and rule. So yes, New Popular Front got 180, Together Alliance got 159, and National Rally got 142.
Yep. So essentially the right that was expected to be able to win enough seats, an outright majority possibly, that would be able to choose the Prime Minister of France. Marine Le Pen had sort of Marine Le Pen had decided, I guess, to step back and had a charismatic youngster named Jordan Bardella. This was, all practically, the presumptive Prime Minister of France. This was France's new government. And I think heroic is probably overstates it, but quite intelligently and indicating great leadership and statespersonship, the left and the center in France got together to keep the right from coming in power. And that was very inspiring. That's very cool. But it also, we're in this situation now where
immediately fell apart as soon as their goal was achieved.
But that's the thing, Rory, is it never actually came together because Macron has been delaying actually nominating the prime minister, which is what the president constitutionally does. And he's now just sort of delaying it until the end of the Olympics, which that's at least 2 weeks from now. It's in August at some point, which is kind of weird from a July election. People would like to get along, get into the business of government. And now we're running into this interesting situation where the left and the right kind of want the same thing.
Well, the pension reform and they want a proportional representation would be the two main ones they both agree on.
Well, and the proportional representation, considering the complexity and the mess of all this, is honestly probably not that bad idea. Not that bad an idea. But the pension reform, and I think this is just the first one that they agree on. I think broadly, the left and the right, and this is something that can be a bit confusing for, say, Republicans in the United States, is that the left in continental Europe more broadly, the conservatives in the UK are closer to those in the United States, though the conservatives at least claim to be for the National Health Service and things like that. Continental right-wing parties in Europe generally are big on social provision. They don't want to give welfare to immigrants, but they want to give heavy.
Yes, that's the big one. Oh, if we didn't give all this money to these brown people, everything would be perfect.
Exactly. They want to keep giving money. Whereas the sort of right-wing answer in the United States is like, well, we'll use immigrants to avoid giving money to anybody. In continental Europe, they're quite openly saying, no, we want more money for white people. And actually, even now with the sort of veneer that Marine Le Pen has put on the RN, it's, they want more money for all French citizens. We'll just kick out more of the brown ones.
Yes.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Scrap birthright citizenship they're looking to do, and family reunion rights. Just a whole lot of classic right-wing things you would expect. They want asylum seekers to be processed abroad, which is always a nice thing to hope for.
Well, that's a very all this sounds exactly like Trump stuff. And Trump is definitely less slash the social welfare state than the Republican Party has traditionally been. But he still staffs his government with the old school slash government types. So it is a very interesting contrast worth pointing to. But the reason I brought this up is that the left agreed, yes, of course, we must keep Le Pen out of power. We do not want a right-wing government to do all these terrible things to migrants. But the left and the right, the largest and the third largest coalitions, which when they work together can absolutely, that's 180 plus 142, that's 320, can absolutely crush the ensemble, the Macron coalition. They seem to be pretty unified, certainly on the pension reforms from 2023, but also probably on a lot of labor market reforms. Essentially, the whole program that Macron has worked through probably are pretty down with getting rid of all of it. And that's, if that's what the French people want, then that's what the French people should do, right? But then we're getting to what I was talking about at the beginning, which is that things like, in the United States, so far, deficits don't matter.
Yeah.
In France, they kind of do. France has done a great job in a pretty bad class. They look better by contrast, dealing with demographic challenges, stuff like that. But it's just really not, it's a very open question how viable France's finances will be if the Democratic majority, left and right combined, decides to throw out all of Macron's I think austerity might not be exactly the right term, but sort of
neoliberal
cuts to spending and whatnot.
It's the sort of thing the International Monetary Fund tell you to do.
Yeah.
The one theory I've heard that might work, but it involves both the coalitions fracturing, which is sort of snipping off the extremes of both the left and the right. France Unbound, is it called? So apparently Macron doesn't like them. So if you could get rid of them off the left and you could get rid of the National Front on the right, it's possible all those other parties might get along and have some sort of coalition and be able to pass laws through. But that also means that the left are doing their best to be as sort of united as possible, but they probably will fracture at some point.
I don't know. That all sounds very difficult, Rory. And essentially where we're at now is France, member of the Security Council, though it certainly shouldn't be.
I heard the argument for it, to be fair, is as like the EU representative. So theoretically, maybe Britain less so, since it's not so much in EU anymore. And then maybe have Britain replaced by India, say. But yeah,
Britain replaced by India, France replaced by the EU actually does make some sense. But you've got France, member of the Security Council, one of the two main powers of the European Union, one of the more impressive, honestly, probably the third, if not second most impressive military in NATO. Well, maybe third or fourth. Actually, I mean, you
they're
can make an argument.
They're a lot more gung-ho. Like when you consider all the fighting they're doing in North Africa, they are actively in wars that don't seem to get a lot of headlines.
So I guess it is interesting, like, what is a more powerful military? Turkey, UK, France, you can make arguments for all of them.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be France has a better air force while Britain has a better navy, things like that.
And then France might have more scope for independent action than the UK does at this point. I can't get into the minutiae. Regardless, this is a very important country.
Oh, yeah.
In world politics and especially in European politics. And the prospect of it being kind of a basket case for the next 3 years until Macron's presidential term is up is, well, it's interesting. And I'm glad we've been able to discuss it to the extent that we have.
But it's great that Le Pen isn't the prime minister.
Yes, there is that. We can be happy about that. We can be happy about that sort of triumph. But yeah, France remains very much in the woods.
Thank you very much for listening to us at the More Freedom Foundation podcast. Hopefully one day we'll have a better understanding of the minutiae of French politics. I maybe have more of an optimistic approach than Robert. I can't see France being a basket case for too long, and hopefully they'll get things pushed through, but probably Macron will just drag his heels until the Olympics is over in case France gets a bit embarrassed. But I wish you all the very best, and I hope you catch us next time. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.